world order as we know it is deader than the dodo.
I think we are on the precipice of war with Iran.
The attitude is might is right.
Welcome back to the Vancouver Resource Investment Conference.
It is wonderful to have you all here. I'll give a brief introduction and then we'll dive right into it. The man to my left is Frank Giustra, legendary investor and financier in the mining sector, global philanthropist, president and CEO of the Fiore Group, and co-chair of the International Crisis Group. We have Colonel Douglas Macgregor, decorated combat veteran who led forces in the 1991 Gulf War's Battle of 73 Easting, which earned him a Bronze Star for valor. He is also a defense consultant and the author of books such as Breaking the Phalanx. We have Dr. Pascal Lottaz, adjunct researcher at the Waseda Institute for Advanced Study in Tokyo, adjunct professor for European politics at Temple University Japan campus, and host of one of my favorite YouTube shows, Neutrality Studies, which I watch regularly. Gentlemen, it's great to have you all here. Frank, I'd like to start with you, and I want to read a quote from the International Crisis Group website regarding Iran. It says, "Once again, Iran is experiencing nationwide upheaval, and, as on past occasions, the state has responded with brute force. This time, however, U.S. threats of military intervention create additional dangers. Instead, Washington should offer major economic incentives in exchange for meaningful political change in Iran." How can the U.S. thread that needle and come to a diplomatic solution here? And in your view, how much, if at all, is Israel's relationship with the United States driving them in this potential conflict?
Well, it's a very complex situation because you've got both the U.S. and Israel with different motives. Israel would like to see Iran taken out as a major regional power. The U.S. would like to see a different Iran that would have relationships with its neighbors and they could do business with. So these are always in conflict. And the other problem is you've got President Trump, who is unpredictable. And so at the current moment, you've got the USS Lincoln Carrier Group there, and he's creating a military presence near Iran, and we don't know whether this is going to be in anticipation of an attack or whether it's going to be a blockade. But the problem that the U.S. has to deal with when they're thinking about striking Iran is that it's too big for a strike to actually have an effect. And so they're having trouble with, I think, making a decision. And again, unfortunately, you can't get a clear sense of policy because it's President Trump.
Colonel Macgregor, I'd love to get your thoughts there and a follow-up on what Frank was saying in terms of the situation in Iran and the unpredictability of President Trump. How do you see that whole scenario playing out? Do you think there is a real risk of America striking Iran? And I'd also love to get your thoughts on Israel's potential involvement as well.
Yes, I think we are on the precipice of war with Iran. And the United States and Israel, in this sense, are joined at the hip. President Trump is treating Israel as a forward operating base for American strategic power. And he is convinced that the destruction of Iran, if you can't change the regime, you have to destroy the country, and can be divided and fragmented, and then ultimately dominated by Israel and our interests, which are linked to the oil and natural gas. Now, having said all of that, I don't think it's going to work that way. I don't think it'll turn out that way at all. And this is essentially the same strategic mindset that has committed us to war in Ukraine against Russia. You want to destroy the Russian power, you want to remove the government, you want to divide up the country, steal its resources, and so forth. That has failed in Ukraine, it will fail in Iran.
And Pascal, I'd love to get your thoughts on the situation as well, and also perhaps just diving a little bit deeper into the way that President Trump is kind of changing the game when it comes to international diplomacy, how he seems to just be moving forward with his ideas in potential violation of international law, and how that's changed the game on the geopolitical stage.
Well, it has made everything more unpredictable. The way that he dealt with Iran half a year ago, right? Pretending that they're still in negotiations while actually then later telling us that he had already given the green light to striking first, through Israel, of course. And so this is, I mean, whatever Israel does is done in conjunction with the US and vice versa. So they're really one single team on that. Who calls the shots? I'm not entirely clear. I do think Israel has a very huge voice in the White House. Also, when we look at what just happened with all the demonstrations, that then got supported, of course, by Washington right after Mr. Netanyahu visited. And it seems that now this idea of breaking Iran has not gone away. So they tried once half a year ago. They tried again 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, and it seems that looking at this carrier group that's there, yes, the full-blown war might be on the horizon, or some military ways closing off Iran, trying to do a blockade, which either way would be quite devastating to Iran, but it's a huge danger to the US as well, because at some point Iran will probably have to use again its missiles, and they have shown last summer that they are able to strike quite precisely. So I don't know what the game of the US is, putting all of these sitting ducks right in front of the country, because these ships can sink. But then again, maybe that's the excuse you need in order then to use even more military force. So unless they de-escalate, which I don't see the US doing, I fear for the worst.
I'd like to pivot to Greenland for a moment in relation to the conversation I was just having with the former defense minister. Frank, from your point of view, do you think this could turn into a situation where the U.S. is actually able to acquire Greenland, whether that's through diplomatic means, through a financial transaction, or through actual potential military intervention? Or do you think this is mostly just bluster from Trump?
Well, I think that if you want to just distill the situation in one sentence, it's basically putting a gun to Greenland's head and saying, we want to buy you, which is the old, we'll make you an offer you can't refuse. I don't think there's going to be military intervention or a military use of the military to take Greenland, but I think the threats and the fact that Europe has to grow a spine and hasn't really responded to it in a strong manner, I think that it gives Trump it emboldens Trump to keep the pressure on to get what he wants. Now, the excuses that they're using for the need to have Greenland are all bogus. I mean, the security threats from Russia and China, that's non-existent. The mineral rights, they could get those any time regardless. Greenland's always been open for business. So this is, I think Trump's been emboldened by his success in the original Iran attack and the Venezuela snatching of Maduro without any American casualties, and he's thumping his chest and exerting his presence as the Western Hemisphere is my territory. And really, it's a statement.
And Colonel Macgregor, maybe expanding on that a little bit further in terms of this desire for the Trump administration to gain control over that region of the world. And why do you think, let's start with this, why do you think the Trump administration did abduct President Nicolas Maduro? Was it just simply a show of force? Is any of the talk about narco-terrorism legitimate? Is it just to establish itself as a hegemon in the region? What is your view on why that operation occurred?
It's a little bit like what happened to me as I was walking in the room today. Somebody in the audience came up to me and said, I know you. I've seen you. I said, really? He said, yes, I've seen you on video. I said, what video? He said, well, videos. I said, was I fully clothed? He said, oh, yes. I said, then you saw the right video, thank God. That's kind of the way I look at the administration right now. The Greenland episode is borders on the ridiculous. We Americans, along with you and sisters from you and even the British, and Norwegians and others, we have controlled this Arctic area for 80 years, since the end of the Second World War. There's no reason for us to invade anything. And there's nothing to prohibit us from establishing whatever military installations are required to support satellite surveillance or anything else. And the Danes have been great friends and allies. They've been more than willing to cooperate. So I think this is going to drift away. Now, when you go to Venezuela, Venezuela has also got a history with us. We've been trying to destabilize that place and overthrow the government forever. It hasn't worked very well. And we assembled this massive task force because I think that's the way President Trump likes to do things. This man is a marketing genius. He likes big, terrific, super. Whenever he describes something, it's in the extreme. But what actually happened? Well, what actually happened is that the CIA went in there and spent $50, $60 million to buy everybody off. The joke was that the memo, as they say, had not gotten to one of the air defense batteries because one battery of air defense weaponry opened up and shot up one of the helicopters in the Special Operations Unit. And they said, well, they didn't get the memo. Everybody else got the memo, so nobody fired. And of course, President Trump says, well, this is an act of genius and brilliance and so forth. I think it was an act of desperation. I think he wanted to do something that in retrospect would justify spending how many billions of dollars to assemble this task force? Thousands of troops up in Puerto Rico and so forth. I don't see anything working out as he hopes, because unless you can control what happens on the ground, Venezuela is going to remain Venezuela. The people down there that are in charge are going to stay in charge. So I think both Greenland and Venezuela will sort of drift away. We're not going to hear much about them in the future.
And Pascal, kind of the new American interventionism, the rekindling of it, it seems, is occurring under President Trump. And this was a president who ran on being a peace president. And I had high hopes for Trump, by the way, when he first took office. But it seems like this administration has not gone as he was talking about at the beginning before he started his term. But what are your thoughts on America intervening so much around the world when the idea was supposed to be to make America great again as opposed to being the world's policeman? Where do you think all this is headed, and what do you think the Trump administration's long-term goal is here?
So I don't think Trump or his administration are trying to be the world's policeman. That would be rendering a service, right? And that's not the way that they look at themselves. The MAGA movement, in my view, for the foreign policy always had two competing factions. One was the kind of the peace through strength, interventionism in order to just stamp your foot down and get what you want. And I would count Rubio and others in that camp, especially when it comes to Latin America, right? We crush you and you do as we say or else. There was the other faction though, and I would count Tulsi Gabbard and maybe even J.D. Vance in that camp that I would describe as restrainers. We go back to the ideas of the pre-World War era saying like, no, the United States should be great as the United States, should have its ideals and attract others to work with the US, and we're gonna secure the heartland, right, at home, strategically, and so on. And it seems to me that that restrainer group actually lost out in the administration to the others, the kind of interventionist, let's call them world dominance light version, where the world now becomes the Western Hemisphere. And there they still want to do exactly what they did before. The rest, they have a bit of a different approach. And everything is different when it comes to Israel because of the special relationship that goes through many lobbying routes. That's how I see what's going on.
I have an additional theory on this, why these actions are taking place, Greenland and Venezuela. I think it's a distraction. I think that President Trump got elected on a platform of delivering to the MAGA base, lower the cost of living, manufacturing jobs, and I think he has largely failed thus far to deliver. You know, inflation is still strong, and he hasn't really created manufacturing jobs because it's actually impossible to do in the real world. And then there's the Epstein files, which, you know, keep coming up, and they're not releasing them. And I think Trump is of the mentality that you can distract. It's like, don't look there, look there, don't look here.
Yeah, but I think that actually works to some extent because of how quickly the news cycle moves these days. That's such a big issue, is that a bunch of people cover Epstein and the relation to Trump and the Epstein files, and then right away these events happen, which captivate everybody's attention. So how much of a role do you think social media and the speed at which news moves has kind of helped them in this strategy? And do you think it's going to work ultimately?
No.
I want to switch and go back to you quickly, Pascal, and then we'll get everybody else's thoughts too on the current state of the European Union, because a lot of people are scratching their heads when it comes to the European leadership and the decisions they're making. They seem to, in fact, be insane to a lot of us. We have seen the deindustrialization of Germany. This is related to them shutting down their nuclear power, which, by the way, is one of the most insane things that you can ever do, the cleanest, safest baseload form of power generation in the world. Obviously, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline got blown up in addition to sanctioning Russian natural gas, which has caused their energy prices to skyrocket. And there's so many more issues going on overall in the European Union. Can you help unpack this madness for us? What do you think is the motivation behind the political leadership in the EU right now?
A good part of the leadership of Europe has transitioned the nation state in the sense that if you become the Prime Minister of Estonia, there's a bigger job that waits. It could be in the EU, it could be in NATO. Same thing for the Netherlands and so on. Some of these institutions, the transatlantic ones, but the EU as well, it works in a very similar way, kind of capture or offer a higher office, even more influence, or more to like massage ego of these people that have already been groomed for 40, 50 years in elite circles. So the care for Germany, for Estonia, for Poland, of the people running Europe today is really just, it's not pivotal. It's not on their mind all the time. What's on the mind is like, so what to do now for the group and how to keep us together, which is why when Donald Trump says, I want Greenland, the only threat to EU territorial integrity comes from the US, and the German Chancellor, Mr. BlackRock Merz, who worked for BlackRock, and you can be sure he will go back to BlackRock, right, and make a lot of money out of that. He stands there and says, we will defend Greenland from Russia. Well, I mean, you're just as captured as it gets, but that's what it is. I mean, these elite circles, of which, you know, the transatlantic institutions, there's many, there's the think tanks and so on, they're very, very effective in creating a epistemic community. They believe the same thing because they've been in the same circles. Look at Davos and how they were talking about this. So I think it's just that they're like captured in the mind.
Could I add something? I think it's important to see it in a broader context. I think all of the institutions, this is certainly true for us inside the United States, the institutions of governance and military institutions, but when you look at the European Union, you look at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, these institutions have been largely unchanged for many, many decades. And I think they are all reaching block obsolescence. And that's something we ought to understand. And that instead of treating that as a horrible nightmare, we ought to look at how the world may be different in the future and how we can fit into it. And I think your Prime Minister, when he spoke in Davos, essentially made that argument, and he's correct on that.
Additionally, I think Europe suffers from two problems. The leadership is weak. They need to grow a spine in terms of responding to Trump. But you have to understand that Europe is really a vassal state of America. There are U.S. military bases throughout Europe. They're not really in a position to stand up to the U.S., and Trump knows that.
I would like to get all of your thoughts. This will be one question for all of you because 2026 has started off with quite a bang on the geopolitical stage. Things seem to continue to be accelerating. Some would say we're in a fourth turning type of scenario. But I'm wondering, as you look over the geopolitical landscape as we sit here today, what are the major things that have you concerned? And what, if anything, makes you optimistic about the trajectory of the world here in 2026? Frank?
The answer to the second question is no. I think we're going through a change in the world order. I mean, the world order as we knew it is deader than the dodo. It's done. The question is what comes next, and what does that transition to a new world order down the line will look like. And you know what's interesting? 5 years ago I did an interview where I talked about the prospect of a new world order. And they posted this interview, they tried to post this interview on the internet, on YouTube, and Google censored the phrase New World Order. Last week at Davos, it was the most commonly used phrase. It's happening. And if you look throughout history, whenever there's a change of the world order, the danger of conflict, it's almost certain that you're going to have conflict. Only once in history that I can recall is when the baton was passed from Britain to America after World War II, after the Suez Crisis. But typically, when you have a transition, a declining power and a rising power, there's conflict. So I'm not very optimistic. I'm afraid we're already setting the stage for World War III.
Walk us through that a little bit before I turn to Colonel Macgregor. What signs are you seeing that make you think we could be entering a World War III scenario?
Well, I think the nationalism, the talk, the thumping of the chests, the intense competition between China and the U.S. or China and the West with respect to critical minerals. I think that's a big one. What's happening in the Middle East, the fact that Israel, at the very least, is determined to cause the Iranian regime to come down, and Iran is not Iraq. It's a very different scenario, and I think that people underestimate the damage that the Iranians can do to the region, including to the U.S. and especially to Israel, if they push them far enough.
In answer to the first question, I would argue that the most important things will be decided not in the Middle East, not in Latin America, not in Africa, not in Eastern Europe. They'll be decided inside the United States. We are moving through profound change. Our society has changed dramatically over the last 30 years, demographically, culturally. We have a lot of unfinished business inside the United States, and we are compelled to focus there. That's something that when I worked for President Trump, I thought he understood very clearly, but that, of course, was November, December 2020. That's a long time ago. But his view was very much the same. We must focus here at home, desperately. I hope we do. I hope that this latest episode with Iran will be the end of something, not the beginning of something, but we don't know. Second thing, we are very much like the British, unfortunately, in the sense that we are another maritime aerospace power. We are not really a land power. When we move forces overseas, it's temporary, it's an exception. It's not standard operation. That has changed over the last 80 years, but if you look at the numbers of forces overseas, they have progressively dropped. Now, we're about to spend unholy amounts of money on defense. We can't even audit the place. We don't know where all the money goes. It's ridiculous. It's not going to change anything. It's not going to improve our position. But my point on the British is this. We cannot do as we have been doing for the last 80 years, moving into regions of the world, distorting the regional dynamics, and then suddenly pull out. Because it's similar to what happens with a bucket of water. You put your hand in it, you displace the water. When you pull your hand out, the water returns. Right now, the Turks are extremely concerned about what could happen in Iran. They are unhappy with us because even though the Turks and the Iranians have differences, the last thing they want to see is the destruction of Iran. Anyone with a brain who looks at that region doesn't want that. And unfortunately, that's the path we're on, because that's what Mr. Netanyahu wants. That would be a disaster.
And does anything have you optimistic at all here in 2026?
I'll talk about video later.
I'm a born optimist, so maybe let me do this one. And to get a little bit of optimism, maybe let's look at the things that don't change or that are not that obviously questioned. So, some people are saying that the Board of Peace is Donald Trump's approach at creating a counter-United Nations. I think that's nonsense. The Board of Peace is going to be an investment vehicle of an international organization under the chairmanship of Trump, which is for life, and then he can designate a successor. It's a wonderful way for building his private brand. It has nothing like a UN. The United Nations, although the US just pulled out of 60 or so UN organizations, which is a blow to them, but it's a financial blow mainly. The US has never threatened to completely withdraw. They might do it, but the rest of the world doesn't question them. The Chinese don't question the UN, the Russians don't, the Europeans don't. Everybody agrees we need the UN Charter. So actually everybody says, no, we want to do it under the UN Charter, whatever we do, and then they go and break the Charter, but at least they say, no, this is what we need. So we still have a global agreement that we need international law in one way or another. It's being broken at the moment. It's being spat on and twisted around. But the idea that we need it is still there. So that makes me optimistic. We are not getting rid of everything. I mean, it's not that China and Russia say like, okay, fine, we're going to nuke the hell out of Washington and let's do Armageddon. No, they're actually saying Armageddon needs to be averted, right? And the Russians keep saying we will abide for one more year by the last treaty we have, even though we don't have to. Please, US, let's sit down and be grown-ups and adults. So that's a good thing, right? So, and if you look at Ukraine, how it developed, I mean, the one thing the NATO made clear is that it doesn't want to fight a direct war with Russia. Had they wanted, they could have. They don't. They want to fight a proxy war. So there's still some form of rationality that wants to keep this, warfare limited. I hope that remains. It might change, but to me it looks as if, though, there's some form of still rational assessment of let's not go to Armageddon. So maybe that's the most optimistic I can offer.
Well, we've got a few minutes left here. Appreciate that optimism. Frank, I'd love to get your thoughts on something that Pascal said, which is the fact that international law is still needed, but is very much being broken, and the rules-based order seems to be falling apart. I mean, there was no reaction to Trump abducting Maduro, no international courts getting involved. I mean, what's going on in Gaza today, although has been condemned, and international criminal courts have said Netanyahu's a criminal because of it. It doesn't matter. He moves around with complete immunity. Nobody's arresting him. What do you make of this kind of breakdown of the rules-based order, if it even existed in the first place, and where do you see this all headed?
Well, you just answered the question. It did not exist in the first place. It was a farce. I mean, the West has talked about the international rules-based order for decades and has behaved differently when it's in their own interest to do so. So, the hypocrisy is well known around the world. So nobody believes anymore that it ever existed. They're just saying the quiet part out loud now under Trump. He's just basically saying what they've always been doing without any shame. And right now, the attitude is might is right. And as far as, the UN, I mean, the only problem with the UN is that unless you have UN reform with the UN Security Council, nothing's going to, they're impotent. They can't really agree on anything when everybody's got a veto right within the Security Council and the 5 permanent members. So I don't know how the UN could be effective, although you would like it to be.
Any last words you'd like to share, Colonel?
One thing I would keep in mind is that if you go back to the 19th century, when the decision was made in London by Parliament to end the slave trade, which of course was strongly supported by Queen Victoria, the Royal Navy ended the slave trade. In other words, the arm of enforcement was the British Empire and its Navy. If a great power does not enforce it, it doesn't exist. It's that simple. We have been living now, certainly since the Second World War, in a state of Pax Americana. That is coming to an end. And in future panels, we'll talk about the financial aspects of this whole thing, and economics and so forth, and that's why it's ending. You know, you can't have a great power that's in the kind of debt we are, but more important, you can't have a great power whose living standards are falling through the floor, and tens of millions of people are not enjoying the fruits of their labor. So that's the one point. The notion that the UN, I've always said the UN is more sinned against than sinning. They have no power unless we give it to them. And that means our forces.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you all so much. Everybody, a warm round of applause for Frank Giustra, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and Dr. Pascal Lottaz.